Hello everyone, welcome back. And today's topic is going to be on the difference between psychological or cognitive types and personality types. When we are discussing MBTI and Jungian psychology, a lot of the times we use the term personality type to describe something that it really isn't meant to be describing. So today I really want to go into the difference between kind of how Carl Jung envisioned his system when he was describing these psychological or cognitive types, and maybe where we've come to misinterpret them now as personality types through the MBTI system. Before we get into the video, though, I would like to remind everybody that I do offer coaching and personality assessment. So if you'd like to learn more about yourself, or you'd like some help getting through any struggle you might be experiencing in life, or you'd like help in maybe achieving some sort of goal, please consider checking out my website, chrisgpsych.com, where you can book a personality assessment or coaching session with me. With that in mind, let's get into the video. So when we look at Carl Jung's introduction to his theory, psychological types, the thing that kind of started the personality type movement, 100 years ago practically at this point, we can really see that as he was describing these types, there is a reason that the book is called Psychological Types as opposed to Personality Types. Because in Carl Jung's theory, in his vision, what he was describing was not the expression of a personality. He was not describing the way in which we kind of express ourselves. He was instead attempting to describe the differences in how our minds function, the types of cognition and psychological functioning that humans have, and the differences in that. The one way that you can think about this is that it's either going to be kind of an input versus output model. Like with cognitive functions, cognitive types, and psychological types, we're working more so with input. We're attempting to see how information is processed in the first place, not what we do with that information. What we do with that information is more closely related to our personality, because then we start to get individual variances in how that information is treated based on, how we're processing it. So it's not even really like personality types are the same thing in this nature, because psychological types are attempting to see, again, how we process the information, what is important to us about that information, what is the thing that is standing out the most to us when we are presented with a new situation or some form of information. That's the thing that our psychological or cognitive type is going to be latching on first and foremost, and that's going to be the thing that we notice and value. Our personality type, on the other hand, is going to be what comes after that, or our personality in general. You don't even have to view it through the lens of personality type. I personally am of the opinion that you don't need to think of something like MBTI or Jungian type and something like Big Five as opposed to each other. I don't necessarily see them attempting to measure the same thing, because Carl Jung was more interested in cognition, whereas the Big Five people, McCree, Costa, were more interested in the expression and measurement of personality traits, which is the output aspect of the example that I was giving earlier. Another way to think about the input versus output example is that Carl Jung's system was an attempt at a psychological theory that was going to be explanatory in nature, meaning he wanted to describe the hows and whys of human cognition and was less so interested in the byproduct of that, what that how and why produced. Whereas if you look at Big Five, it was designed from the foundation up to be descriptive in nature. And this is something that the developers openly admit, is that Big Five does not even begin to attempt to describe how or why these traits arise from people, and instead says, okay, these are the traits that we can measure that are being produced from whatever underlying mechanism there is that we're not measuring. So it's saying, okay, we now see that there's these 5 traits and we can measure them, but we don't have the explanatory power in this theory to tell you where those traits are being produced from. It could be biology, it could be upbringing, there could be 100 different things that it could be, but it's not attempting to give you that explanation. Whereas Carl Jung's psychological types are attempting to say, okay, this is the how and why of why you're getting these results. This is essentially going to be how humans' minds function. And of course, Carl Jung's theory was a little bit more philosophical in nature. He wasn't as interested in the kind of neuroscientific aspect of it or even the quantitative side of things. He was more so interested in, okay, this is what I've observed, and this is how I could theoretically explain how I think people think differently from one another because of their cognitive preferences. And I know this is a lot to kind of take in when we're discussing these differences. So now let's go on to the difference between what a cognitive type is and, let's say, a personality type using MBTI, because we've discussed the difference between like cognitive types and personality traits. So what's the difference between the cognitive type and the personality type of MBTI? To understand the difference between a cognitive type and a personality type, we need to look at when the psychological types became personality types, and that's going to be with the Briggs duo and their family when they developed the MBTI theory. So this theory essentially took Carl Jung's cognitive and psychological types and said, okay, what is the byproduct of this? What can we do with this knowledge? How can this knowledge be applied in some sense, whether it's through relationships or people or helping people find what interests they may have in life, these sorts of things. Jung was less so interested in that. Jung was less interested in, okay, what is the byproduct of my theory? More so, he was interested in the explanatory power of his theory. How do humans work? How do their minds function? These sorts of things. And then the Briggs duo essentially said, great, that's interesting. Now this is what we think is the results of that. And that's why their type system added things, moved things around a little bit, and eventually they began to talk a lot about how they could use type in practical settings. And I really think that was the core idea behind the MBTI originally, was discussing human differences. How can we recognize the byproducts of our cognitive preferences, and how can we be aware of these when we're communicating with other people and trying to learn more about ourselves and others. And I think this is really present. If you read Gifts Differing, you can see that there's chapters on like, marriage and communication and school and job preferences and these sorts of things, which are things that Jung didn't even really touch on. So the real difference between the psychological type and the personality type is that the psychological type is attempting fully to explain the hows and whys, whereas the personality type is saying, okay, we're running with this theory of hows and whys, and we assume that it's relatively correct. What is the byproduct that is then given out through a person and represented through their personality? And what decisions are most likely going to be made by most people with this personality type? And then how can we use that information to better inform people about their relationships and their communication with other people and their personal development? One way to think about that is in Carl Jung's theory. If we were looking at, say, for example, introverted thinking as a function, we might say, okay, an introverted thinking dominant type, like an INTP or an ISTP, is going to be someone who, when presented with information, wants to really slowly digest that information, process it, and make sure that they have a really logically consistent understanding of the topic that they are approaching, as opposed to the extroverted thinking type who wants to apply that information right off the bat at the expense of maybe the consistency. But we can't say in Jung's original theory by itself what the person is then going to do with that understanding. How are they going to react to that understanding? How are they going to categorize it? How are they going to use it, organize it? That is something that is going to be more closely representative of the Briggs personality type, which is the compromise between, okay, here's the whys, here's the hows, and here is how it is presented in the individual. Even in the Briggs 16 types, though, we're not going to see it fully saying all types do this. It instead says types are most likely to do this. We're talking about tendencies. We're talking about natural preferences that can be gone against, but if we look at the kind of wide spectrum of a given type, we might see that most of them are likely to act or think in certain ways, and that if you're then aware of those preferences, you can make changes yourself that will allow you as a person and your personality to grow. The main reason I wanted to cover this topic is because when we're looking at Carl Jung's original theory, it's not ridiculous to attempt to map something like Big Five or even the MBTI theories kind of over it to really get a better understanding of the individual differences across personality systems that can be represented by different things. Say, for example, we're looking at an INTJ in the MBTI system. We would expect someone who's relatively socially introverted, fairly conscientious, these sorts of things. But when we look at Jung's system through the lens of information processing, through the lens of cognition, that doesn't immediately mean that someone is going to be conscientious just because they have a value for the extroverted thinking function. So, say, for example, I've worked with many INTJs in coaching who are struggling to be conscientious. If they took the Big Five assessment or any version of it, they would probably score in the lower range of conscientiousness. So then that leads to the idea that personality is something that you can grow or change when you look at it through the lens of a trait model, which is why I'm fully supportive of the idea that your personality as a trait can change. But when we're looking at something like the Jungian system of personality, these things don't change because they're more so in the realm of cognition. They're more so the hardware. They're kind of like the computer that you're running on. You can't just change out the parts by yourself. I mean, in reality, you can change parts on the computer, but assuming that you were a computer, you wouldn't be able to change the parts yourself. And that's the idea behind cognitive functions, kind of, is that you are born with these kind of parts in your brain, and they don't limit you into what you can do, but they do give you a general direction of what information is going to be important to you and how you're going to process information and the order in which you're going to process information. And no one method is going to be superior to another. There's no ranking of functions that's going to be better than others. We're just going to find that there's a lot of tendencies with how those preferences lead to certain outcomes, lead to certain things. And that's really the main idea here, is that your personality and personality type can be something that can be mapped over Jungian cognitive theory. They don't have to be something that are perfectly unified. And in fact, I would say that it's better to consider your personality as something relatively separate from your psychological or cognitive type, because your personality is something that's more changeable.